My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Director for Education and Research at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And as David said, I will be the moderator of the webinar discussion today. And we aim for around 40-45 minutes of engaging discussion with our webinar panelists and around 15-20 minutes questions afterwards. We will also have two polls which we would ask participants to take while we conduct that webinar. Today we have terrific panel discussions. Joining us is Lucia Mendizabal, the Guatemalan activist who was one of the leaders of Renuncia Ya and took part in the nonviolent movement against corrupt government in Guatemala last year. That movement forced the resignation of the ministers, vice president, president, and forced also new elections that took place in autumn last year. Another panelist is Alejandro Salas, the Regional Director for Americas for Transparency International, the leading non-governmental organization dedicated to shining light on corrupt practices and measuring corruption globally. And last but not least, Shaska Beirle, a researcher and writer on anti-corruption struggles, who is also Senior Advisor to ICNC. Welcome again the panelists and those who join us today. And before we begin our discussion, we would like to take a quick poll among participants to assess their views about various methods to fight corruption. So here there would be a pop-up screen that you will see on your computers, and the question is, what do we need to fight corruption effectively? And you can choose any of the responses. Anti-corruption czar within government, law with higher penalties for corruption, independent national anti-corruption bureau, non-violent anti-corruption campaigns, international anti-corruption tribunal. So take a moment and select your choices. And I think we can right now the display show the results.
All right, it looks like we've still got a few more coming in.
Okay.
It looks like 2/3 of everybody has voted.
So actually the 90% already of the participants thought that kind of grassroots movements play an important role in fighting corruption. 70% chose independent national institution to fight corruption, stricter law 50%, and 26% thought that international anti-corruption tribunal would be good to fight corruption, and only 4% chose the anti-corruption person within the government that would lead the charge against corruption. Great. Okay. So discussion about the grassroots anti-corruption struggles must naturally begin from looking into corruption itself. Most corrupt countries are the ones that are least democratic, where the permissive culture for corrupt practices is deeply ingrained in daily social interactions. Pervasive corruption is the main culprit for increasing level of poverty, repression, political instability, bad governance. And in fact, it was corruption rather than, for example, violent extremism that one of the retired generals in the US Army, John Allen, identified as the main challenge, for example, for stabilizing Afghanistan. In his testimony to Congress in 2014, he said that Taliban's, they are not really existential threat to Afghanistan. They are just annoyance. In fact, the existential threat comes from the magnitude of corruption with which the Afghan authorities must contend. And those days, for example, in Iraq, protesters are coming out to demonstrate against corrupt sectarian politics, failed services, and rise of violent extremism. And they also connect rise of violent extremism with corruption. There is someone reported that there was a banner in Tahrir Square in Baghdad in Iraq that read, "Daesh and corruption are two sides of the same coin." In 2015, Thomas Carothers and Richard Youngs from Carnegie Endowment published a report titled The Complexities of Global Protest, and according to the authors, one fundamental trigger of mass protests in the last 10 years was corruption. And the corruption was the main driver of the protests both in authoritarian and democratic states. And people are both the victims of corruption, but they are also participants in corruption. So people and their actions constitute, in my view, the problem, but also they offer a potential solution. And potential solution, as speakers will argue, can be found in people's-led anti-corruption campaigns and movements, where ordinary people would use civil resistance methods to challenge corrupt practices. And this is what I would like to start our discussion from, turning to one of our panelists, Shaska Berele. And Shaska, could you tell us how we should understand the whole phenomena of civil resistance struggles against corruption? Is it something new? What are the main characteristics? And what is exactly the role of ordinary citizens in fighting corruption?
It's not something new. It's been going on for at least 2.5 decades, if not longer, if one looks at struggles even such as the People Power movement in the Philippines, which had to do with a very corrupt authoritarian regime. However, one can see that there is a growing intolerance around the world to corruption. And that is clearly thanks to the efforts of international and national civil society and the mobilization of regular citizens around the world. So I was just doing like a mini survey for myself, just looking at what was happening last year. And in addition to the countries you mentioned, we have, of course, the stellar case from Guatemala, which we will hear about. We're so privileged to have Lucia with us. There were also campaigns in Honduras, in Armenia, in Lebanon, in Malaysia, Moldova, Romania, Serbia, South Africa, the US, the UK. And one can see from these campaigns that that people mobilize around corruption for, generally speaking, 2 reasons. One is when power holder corruption, whether it's in the government or in other sectors of society, is so widespread, so blatant, and there is so much impunity that people become angered. They collectively become insulted and angered by it, and they say, now it's enough, we have to do something. Another major motivating factor is that corruption is linked, as you mentioned, to so many different kinds of injustices and problems, serious problems and grievances that people face every day in their lives. So for them then, corruption is linked to these injustices. So in order to address these injustices like poverty, like lack of access to justice, for example, social services, medicine, schooling, all these things, for them to address these grievances, they have to address simultaneously corruption. One thing to mention is that what is corruption then? And I know that David is going to put up a slide with just a short definition of corruption and then a longer one. I'm not going to read it out, but we have the Transparency International definition at the top. What I advocate is to expand that definition into a systemic definition, because corruption is just not random transactions. And if we want to tackle it, we have to understand how we define it in order to understand how we actually tackle it. So it is actually a system of abuse of power. And it's not just for private gain, it's for many different kinds of gain, as you can see from the slide. It involves many kinds of relationships. Most of them are hidden, as we know. And in these relationships, there are all these vested interests to perpetuate the system. And so when we think about how to combat corruption, we have to understand that we are facing a system. And through understanding of the dynamics of actually nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, we can gain new insights into strategies, both top-down and bottom-up, to tackling these systems of corruption.
Thank you, Shaska, for explaining that kind of framework, and this would be quite important when we move forward discussing specific cases. And that's what I want to right now turn to and ask Alejandro about his experience with anti-corruption movements or mobilizations in Latin America. Alejandro, could you tell us about main challenges as well as opportunities for anti-corruption mobilization in the region that you see? What holds people back? What enables the activism in Latin America to fight corruption?
Well, thank you everyone, and hi. I will definitely endorse what Shaska just said and give it a more Latin American flavor to then go to what you're asking. What are the opportunities and the challenges? I have to say that I'm optimistic. I think there are more opportunities nowadays, and especially because in Latin America for decades there has been this a bit fatalistic approach of thinking that, you know, it's part of our culture, that's the way we are in Latin America, there's nothing we can do about it, let's live with it. And the good news is that in the last years, that anger Shaska was talking about, or the awareness of people, together with the new opportunities presented by social media, presented by access to information. Latin America is a region that has advanced a lot in terms of access to information. There's very strong investigative journalism. So there's a lot of elements that are changing the way people perceive themselves in these regimes that have been historically affected by corruption. So I think one of the main things is that people understand now that there is no good reason on why cross your arms and decide that that's the way things should remain. I think for the first time, people, citizens in Latin America are realizing that corruption actually has a negative effect in their quality of life. And this is something, as curious as it sounds, it probably has to do a lot with economic prosperity. Now we are in a moment of depression, so we need to see what's going to happen. But for many years in the past decade, the economy was doing fine, countries were growing, a lot of poor people were starting to become emerging middle classes, and the emerging middle classes started having different demands from their governments, from the state. It was not anymore about basic survival, but it started being more about, I want that my children have more opportunities than me. I want them to have better education. I want them to be healthy. I want a transport that is not dangerous and inefficient. So the demands started changing, and very quickly, particularly in Brazil, I would say 3-4 years ago, people started connecting the poor quality of basic public services, the emerging economies growing, and this aspect of, you know, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, many countries growing at very high rates, and realizing that the quality of their life, that the way it worked for their families and households was not growing at the same speed. So I think that's one of the main triggers that helps explain why the fight against corruption became so prominent among large groups of population, and that finally, and that's why I say these are the opportunities, because people now don't see it as something that we need to learn to live with, but something that actually we can do something about it. And I think that's the big change, and that's the important context we are living in right now in the region, with differences between countries, of course, but I'm talking in general.
Yes, and that kind of spirit of we can do, that was certainly visible in Guatemala. And I would like to turn to Lucia and ask her about what happened in her own native country. We know that last year we essentially saw something incredible, because the information that we had about Guatemala was mainly about violence, about civil war, about high crime, and corruption, of course, but nothing else. And suddenly last year we had mass non-violent mobilization against corruption, and that led to significant changes. So Lucia, could you tell us please about the anti-corruption movement in Guatemala? How did it grow? How did it grow? who started it, how people managed to kind of wake up and break apathy and passivity and kind of stand together and collectively fight with corrupt elites and corruption generally.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to say that former Vice President Roxana Valdetti started it all because, as you said, Guatemala is known as a corrupt country, or most like most Latin American countries. And but she went one step further, and she started mocking the press whenever they ask her about something that was going on. Like, for instance, I think it was in 2014, the government hired a company to clean out a lake, but nobody knew what was the product that they were going to use. And so they started to investigate, and it turned out to be salt water. And they were selling gallons of salt water to pour into the lake for 22.8 million quetzales, that it's around $3 million. So that really got people angry, because it was very obvious that they were using the money that was supposed to be used for schools and hospitals for their own benefit. And of course, meanwhile, the schools and the hospitals were broke and everything was turned around. But at that moment, nobody did anything. And when the press asked her about that, she came out, and because people were saying that they were stealing the money from government. And she swore in front of everybody, and she said something like, "I swear for the life of my dead mother that I haven't stole any money." And so people was mocking her and doing all that stuff. But then on April 16 of last year, the MP, that it's the public ministry of Guatemala, headed by Del Maldana, and we have a UN organization that works against corruption and impunity, that it's called CICIG here, and it's headed by Ivan Velázquez. And they work in a case that it's called La Línea, and it had to do with people not paying the right amount of taxes in all the imports. What they did was they charge 30% of the taxes to the importers, then they charge another 30% that was distributed among all the people that were in the chain of corruption, including former Vice President Roxana Valdetti and former President Otto Pérez Molina, and her secretary, Juan Carlos Monzon, and some other people that were involved. And so they came out and they revealed to all the population that this was going to happen, this was happening. And of course, it wasn't the first time that we knew that something like that was happening, but it was the first time that we could make a link between the corruption and something as close as Juan Carlos Monzon. And I remember I was watching the news that night, and I really got angry, and I went into Facebook, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this is unbelievable, we should do something about it." And I placed a comment on my Facebook account, and I said, well, I invite everybody to do something about it. And if you want to do something for your country, this is the moment, and we shouldn't wait for the elections that were to be held by the end of the year to do something, but we have to do it now. And I placed the same post in a group called Politically Incorrect. And it went to everybody in that group. It was like 8,000 people there. And I went to sleep. This was about 11 o'clock in the evening. And the next day, I opened my computer and I checked Facebook, and I find out that a lot of people were saying, yes, let's do something about it. What do you, when do we get together and go protest or do something? And at that moment, I realized that I had really called out for people to protest. And so I had to call the shots. And one of the people that was there, her name is Alejandra de Calderon, she suggested that I open a new page or a new group, and I had used the Facebook events before for family reunions and stuff, so I decided to use a Facebook event and made it public, and I started publishing, and she helped me, and some other people helped me, and I invited my friends, and my friends invited their friends, and this was at around 10 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of April, and I think that by probably noon, over 1,000 people had agreed to go to the protests. So I was really, really scared at that moment because I didn't know, I have never done anything like that before. I had no experience, political experience or any kind of experience putting up a protest. But I understood that since I had spoken, that I had to do something about it. And some of my friends joined me as organizers. And one of them proposed to use the Renuncia Ya hashtag, and there was this logo, and maybe David...
Just resign now.
Yeah, resign now, Renuncia Ya. And this is it. Thank you very much. And I think this was a very powerful image that we use, and around noon also, one of the major newspapers here in Guatemala, Siglo XXI, published that we were gathering protest for Saturday 25th. At the beginning it was on Saturday 18th, but then we moved it to the 25th. So more people will know about it.
You see a fascinating story about how the campaign started. So we had essentially humiliating remarks coming from the power holders, essentially treating citizens as goats and people that don't think, and that would not feel kind of humiliation because of the corruption. Then we've got the role of the external actors such as UN Commission that provided evidences and information about corrupt practices, and then we've got individuals like you who thought that this is the moment to do something, and then calling people to come out. So I wanted to take this and ask Alejandro whether you could see similarities or differences in terms of how campaigns and movements against corruption are coming out, are emerging, forming in other Latin American countries. Would it be a similar process to what Lucia just described in terms of how it happened in Guatemala, or maybe some different factors that play a role in emergence of those campaigns and people going out and protesting?
Well, I think there are two very relevant issues that are strong similarities. And one of them is that those who start the movement and who give the first steps, like Lucia, don't feel alone very quickly. No, it's not just a small group of activists or a professional NGO or whatever, but very quickly there's follow-up to it. And I'm not referring only to mass demonstrations or to going to the streets, but also other types of campaigns. And again, this is facilitated many times by the existence of social media and the possibility of people to connect very quickly and to identify. And as I was saying before, to the fact that people, at least in the Latin America region, are starting to believe that they can do something about it. No? So that's, I think, a key element. People don't feel alone. People can quickly rally other around them. Now, the other one, and this is more controversial, is the fact that you can actually start to see results. Because in Latin America for a long, I mean, corruption has existed always. It's not something new. The thing is that recently, in the last couple of years, you have a feeling that it's out of control, because you see it from Mexico in the north to Chile in the south, and you have all sorts of stories involving presidents and ministers, big shot business people, etc. And it seems like corruption is going wild in Latin America as never before. But the truth is that we don't know. Nobody can really measure if 50 years ago, 20 years ago, there was more or less corruption than now. I think the fact that it seems to be more now, it's simply because some of the more legal kind of reforms and some of the anti-corruption measures that have been set up in the last 20 years are working now. As I mentioned before, access to information, much more use of electronic government. So these kind of things where people can actually go and check how the money is spent, how decisions are taken. So I think those are basically the similarities. No? You can rally people quickly around you. People are more concerned and more identified with the issue and more optimistic that something can come out of it, of investing your time and your efforts. And I would say a third one is the use of technology, which is widespread and it's easy access to many million citizens in the region. Now, quickly, to mention some of the differences, I'm sorry, there's a fourth one which I think is very relevant for us, is that most, if not all, of the relevant movements in the region against corruption have been peaceful, which is also something very important. I mean, violence has not played a very strong role, with some exceptions, but normally the rule is peaceful, like in Guatemala, which was extremely peaceful. No? I think the main differences are related to the possibility to link to existing institutions. Lucia was mentioning very clear how in Guatemala there was this International Commission Against Corruption and Impunity of the United Nations. A lot of the strength of this movement could rely on the trustability, because this institution could be trusted, and was pushing for prosecution, working with the local prosecutionality to support this movement. In Brazil, where also millions have gone out in the streets, there are very brave judges, prosecutors, certain sectors of the federal police that are also amazingly have become like national heroes. I mean, it's not very common to see people in the streets clapping and cheering a judge. They are usually, you know, these strange elite secret figures. But now Judge Moro in Brazil is like a national hero, and people cheer him in the streets, no? So I think the differences are those. In Venezuela, for example, they have it harder because there's almost no institutions to support or to be a counterpart or to be an ally of these civic or civil mobilizations. I think that's what plays a difference. So these social movements need to find their counterpart, need to be able to work together and empower certain other actors that are part of the state institutions to join forces and work together. I think that's a challenge, and that's probably one of the main differences between countries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I want to build on that theme, both in terms of emergence as well as sustainability and coalition building, and ask Shaska, looking at the cases, you know, outside of Latin America, around the world that you are very familiar with, in terms of how those anti-corruption movements emerged, but also how they sustain themselves, how they expand their outreach, their mobilization, their participation. How does it look like, how those things look like in other anti-corruption campaigns that you are familiar from around the world?
Okay. Well, I'll start with one that's very different. So this is a campaign. I mean, these are grassroots civic initiatives, micro initiatives in communities. So to give one an example of how this kind of power that citizens have can be manifested very broadly at the national level or very locally. So imagine a country where there has been violent conflict, a war, external invasion, civil war, the equivalent of a civil war, bloodshed, insurgencies, natural disasters like earthquakes, extreme poverty, and imagine that, and extremely corrupt system to the point that some people call it, like Sarah Chayes call it, corruption is the system, call the country a kleptocracy. So I'm referring to Afghanistan, which you mentioned, Mache. So what could people do there when they face such corruption that it's really not only so blatant at the highest levels, but it's actually affecting their capacity to live every day and their survival? So in the Integrity Watch Afghanistan, which is a civil society organization several years ago, developed this idea that they wanted to empower small communities to actually impact corruption on things that mattered to them. So it started with reconstruction and development projects. It's now expanded to schools, to judiciary and the delivery of justice, and resource extraction. And what they have done is work with communities to provide them the information and the skills that they need, and then the communities launched their own, what we can call campaigns, to monitor projects, to monitor public activities in order to prevent corruption, correct corruption, and get what they're entitled to get as citizens of their country. So that's one example, and I think you've got a photo that David has shown everybody. And that's very interesting. You just see a lot of men just looking at a pile of stones, but that is actually a nonviolent tactic. It's a monitoring tactic that's part of the community initiatives. So you see, in fact, that this is a road, and these are volunteers. This is an example of part of these community initiatives. On the other hand, we can think of more broader kinds of campaigns that are that take place at less of a micro level, and so imagine that you're living in a city or a region in which the mafia rules everything. The mafia runs things, and if anybody steps out and says anything against the mafia, they're killed. It's guaranteed. Well, that was the situation in Palermo several years ago, over the past several decades, and yet there was this youth movement that developed in Palermo called the Dio Pizzo, which means goodbye extortion money, that in fact has led a nonviolent resistance campaign to what they say is to free their city from the control of the Cosa Nostra mafia. And when we get to tactics, maybe I'll mention one of their tactics.
Yes, and that's what I want to actually focus right now, because we talk about civil resistance anti-corruption campaigns, and I wanted to ask each of you about examples of these civil resistance methods that those campaigns and those movements were using. So, Lucia, to you, could you tell us specific examples of the methods that Guatemalans used when they went out on the streets and protest, or when they engaged in that kind of civil disobedience, civil resistance actions after April last year? So what methods did they use exactly?
To keep it peaceful? Well, we kept a really close supervision on what was going on the page and on Facebook. Somebody from the organizers, was always talking and explaining, because a lot of people were asking who were we and why we were calling for the protest and everything. So we had to start all the time explaining that none of us were politicians, that We were just regular people that was angry about the situation, and then we didn't know anything about it, so we didn't have any specific strategies set. But it turned out that gathering in one place instead of marching to that place was really big on safety. And it helped us assure that nobody was going to be have any repression or measures applied to them. And
Because there were so many. Because there were so many of you.
But also because it's easier when you're walking from one place to another, that in one of the streets, the corners, somebody can be there and you know, fight shots with a gun or something like that. But instead, if we're in one place, the press is around, and also the human rights people is around, and it's better to keep control, you know. And then we talked with the students from the university, and we kept a close relationship. So because there were so many of them, and they really have experience in organizing this kind of things, we asked them to keep to be in charge of safety. And we asked them not to wear masks so no people will infiltrate the lines of the students. And we asked them in general not to destroy any private property or anything, and they agree with us. And then there was this lawyer that helped us, and we placed what it's called, I don't recall the name in English, but it's like a legal movement that we placed to the Corte de Constitucionalidad, which is higher than the Supreme Court. And through that paper, we made former President Otto Pérez Molina and the government personally responsible for the safety of everybody that was there. So police was there, but they were there to protect us from other groups that could go there and start a riot or whatever. And if anything happened to one of the protesters there, like a policeman shot them or whatever, and as far as repression, President Otto Pérez Molina would be responsible for that, and he could face the law, but not civil, but penal law, you know, like
Right.
and
Right. I mean, that's a very interesting, you know, strategies that you described to how the campaign maintain nonviolent discipline and ensure that everything would be peaceful. Alejandro, how it's done usually in other campaigns in Latin America? Maybe you've got some examples of the creative type of methods that campaigns are using, and what are those methods exactly? I think you are muted, Alejandro.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. I was saying that I will give you a couple of examples of a very different nature to illustrate other ways of doing things. I think one very interesting campaign that is actually ongoing, happened in Mexico, because a group of organizations started a very simple hashtag that was the main logo, the main identity behind the campaign, which is the campaign 3 de 3, which roughly translates 3 out of 3. So during an electoral campaign, these groups started using social media to invite candidates to voluntarily adhere themselves, register themselves that they follow the 3 out of 3 principle, which is publish your register of interest, publish your tax declaration and your asset declaration, which is something legal, basic, nothing sophisticated. It's a transparency, accountability principle. So of course the tactic or the example behind is that if you are a politician, of course you want to be elected, and you need to see how you move and take advantage over your other opponents. So some of them were convinced and started registering and saying, I will disclose my 3 out of 3, and they started doing so. So of course there was a monitoring mechanism, and they started appearing in web pages. The media started talking about them, so the others felt pressure, and they also wanted to be in the club of the good guys. So you know, you have this wave of moving people to trying to get in the correct side of things, and that's a very simple tactic but very effective. And it was so effective that even after the elections they decided to go stronger and to make it a principle for all politicians, and to even ask for a reform in the legal framework in Mexico. And this became a campaign where they collected in a few weeks over 1 million signatures from citizens to promote this law. No? So it's something very new, it's ongoing, but they have already achieved some successes. And very quickly, let me tell you another one of if you want a smaller dimension, but very significant, that I like, from South America, from Paraguay, where there was a senator that was involved in some corrupt dealings. And it's very interesting because the owners of some establishment, for example, a pizza restaurant, a meat restaurant, a gas station, the golf club, whatever, they started publishing in the door of the commercial local, saying, we don't serve to corrupt individuals. And they put the name of this senator, plus the other senators of his same party that had supported him. And there were some cases where actually a waiter or the owner of the place would come and say, you know, we're not going to serve you, corrupt people are not welcome here. And this started multiplying to several places. And at the end of the day, the senators from his own political party that were backing this guy to avoid being investigated, they had to give a step down and say, okay, you can go ahead and investigate him. No? So that's a smaller thing, but I think very significant how it's a way of socially sanctioning the corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So before we go to Q&A, I wanted to ask Shaska to tell us, looking at other campaigns around the world and the kind of actions and methods that they use. If Shaska could, maybe you can bring 1 or 2 interesting examples of those methods and the results that they brought about.
Okay, I think you have the slide that you will be able to see. Yeah, so here's a list of some very interesting tactics from the research that I did, which then went into the publication of my book. I guess, can I show it? Curtailing Corruption, People, Power for Accountability and Justice. And so you see a photo at the top, which is very interesting. Opening boxes and counting the textbooks in there. Who would have thought that counting textbooks could be an effective tactic against corruption in public schools? But it is if 1 million Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are counting the textbooks, and it is if you have parents conducting spot checks on the factories that are producing the textbooks, and when you have whole communities involved, and if you have teachers and public service unions and a broader coalition that comes together to actually tackle this problem, to the point that in this instance, over several years, ghost deliveries, fake deliveries of textbooks, poor quality of textbooks basically vanished. The cost of producing textbooks was cut in half because of the corruption was taken out of the system for the contracts for producing the textbooks. So there were real tangible results, and children actually received the textbooks to which they were entitled in the Philippines. So this is in the Philippines. Then an example of a glass. Who would have thought that a glass can be a nonviolent act? But it is when 100,000 glasses are distributed around Egypt during the Mubarak era, and the logo says, we're watching you. So this is part of an innovative low-risk tactic that people can take. And finally, if you would, going back to Italy in the case of the Addio Pizzo youth movement, what the young people did, which was very clever, was that they built slowly a list of businesses that publicly refused to pay extortion money to the mafia. But then what they did at the same time was that they got signatures from thousands of citizens who said that they will patronize those businesses. And then what they did was they started what is called a reverse boycott, which is supporting a business or a company that you want to support rather than not supporting it. So they were supporting the companies and businesses that were basically trying to free themselves from the mafia. And I will finally mention to you, I don't have an outcome, but this has just come in from an activist in England who was reporting back to a number of us in the UNCAC Civil Society Coalition that in the run-up to the UK Anti-Corruption Summit, which ended today, there was an ongoing campaign in London to pressure David Cameron on taking certain measures against global financial corruption and taking measures within the UK, because the UK, along with America and some other countries, are the greatest facilitators of global financial corruption. But they organized klepto tours. So people could go on tours and they were shown all the different banks and law firms and accounting firms that help hide stolen money. And then a group of Russians came and organized bus tours to take people on tours to show them all the luxury properties
Russian residence, right.
that have been purchased with illicit funds that are being laundered into the most expensive properties in London.
Yes, fascinating. I do want to open right now floor to questions from the participants. Before doing so, we've got another very, very short poll that we want to take. David, could you start that poll? It's how can we reduce corruption? And there are also 5 choices that participant can select. You can select more than one, and please go ahead right now so we can quickly see the results. More than 90% people would have selected the kind of grassroots approach to fighting corruption, but there was also quite a lot of support for independent national office that would fight corruption, and then increasing punishment for corrupt practices, and the UN ban on tax havens received 38%, and then the last one is appoint anti-corruption prosecutor within government. Good, great. So with all the points that were made by the speakers, by the panelists, and with the survey results, let's open the floor for questions and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please introduce yourself,
okay,
and say to whom that question goes to.
Perfect. I am Sergio Martinez, and I am from Guatemala too. I shared this experience with Lucia Mendizábal, and I was pleasure to listen here today. Also, I am basically here interested in the topic of the link between economic development and corruption as part of my research. And I wanted to ask a question regarding the legal framework of the right to access of information. I mean that most of the time the civil society movements start with the motivation to enforce basically accountability for the government. But I am wondering, basically I could ask this question to either Lucia Mendizábal or Alejandro Salas about how can the civil society movements find an institutionalization mechanism to follow up the accountability procedures. I ask this because people most of the time needs to be well informed of how to use the accountability systems. For example, in this question, to monitor how the money is spent. So in this case, how for example the institutionalization of civil society movements can lead to training people how to express the accountability language.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess that any panelist could try to address the question. Who would like to go first?
If you want, I can say something.
Go ahead, Alejandro.
Yeah, thank you, Sergio. I think you're touching in a very, very important thing, because we have to be careful, and that's why I like your question, because many times, yes, there's the energy, there's the mobilization, there's the pressure, and like in the case of Guatemala, we can see a few corrupt individuals that were occupying power now sitting in jail, and that's something to celebrate, and that's a triumph. However, a bigger challenge emerges because the systems need to also change, because who gives you a guarantee that the next one that will come is not going to do the same or worse? No, it's about changing the system, and I think that what you're asking is how, in a way, move to this more institutionality to secure that the ones that are taking power after are not abusing. And I think it's a key question for social movements. There are examples of these things failing, probably Egypt, Arab Spring, and many others. There are very important lessons to learn. Now, I believe that there has to be a partnership, or there has to be channels of interaction and communication between these energies that come out of the social movements and some actors. It could be civil society organizations like Transparency International or others. It could be different actors from the international community, or reform-oriented individuals within the systems that are already thinking on what are the measures that are needed to start strengthening the systems that will prevent corruption from happening and repeating itself again. I think there was a very interesting example in the times of former President Fujimori in Peru, when there was a mafia that captured, basically a corrupt mafia that captured many institutions in the state. And at the same time that millions of people were in the street complaining and there was all this energy, there were some individuals, for example, some of the prosecutors working in the case, in alliance with some of the parliamentarians that were at that moment, where they introduced very quickly and almost without nobody noticing 5 or 6 key anti-corruption reforms into the system. And once the chaos of Fujimori and he went away and the country went back into stability, suddenly the country had, in a couple of months, a new system of anti-corruption that in the chaos nobody really noticed. And I think, in a way, this is part of what you're asking. I hope, Sergio, that in every situation, in every case, one needs to find who are the allies and who has already some of these answers to try to improve the system and to open doors for these energies to actually start working in constructing something that will be more permanent and more sustainable.
Thank you, Alejandro. I've got a question that is to Lucia from Jack Smith. He is interested about what is being done to change the culture of impunity in Guatemala going forward, like ethics disclosure, illicit enrichment laws, rewards for information, and independent commission and staffing with trained investigators and prosecutors. And I would add to that question, what is the right now situation with the civil society pushing perhaps for those changes that Jack enumerated? So that kind of force to do more in terms of fighting corruption would not only come from kind of power holders and institutions, but also from the grassroots. So where is the current situation in terms of moving forward with even more kind of anti-corruption processes and efforts?
Okay, as a result of the movement of last year, a lot of groups that are called collectives became and started working towards the anti-corruption fight. And I will always tell them that they need to become legal, like have a legal figure that represents them, so they can do more work, and they have to work with other organizations like TI, the Acción Ciudadana, which is a representative for TI in Guatemala, or Jóvenes por Guatemala, or there are different organizations that were working before the movement of last year, and they already have undergone a path towards eliminating corruption, and they can give information to these collectives. And what they're doing is that they're getting together at least one Saturday each month so they can articulate their work. But they're doing it among the collectives. And because they understand that if everybody is trying to do the same thing, then there are going to be some areas that are going to be left open. And here in Guatemala, we have a great law that it's a law that allows people to get all the information from the government. It means that the information from the government, they are commanded to give out whatever question you ask, they have to give it out to you. If you want to know how the money is being spent, or what are the policies that the government are facing, or whatever, if you go out to a ministry and ask these questions, they have to give it to you, or otherwise they could be sent to jail. So it is important that people know about this law, how it works, on our benefit, and that we use as the tool to assure that we can erase corruption from the country. Because I think a lot of work has been done before. And also, it is very good that we have all these other organizations as MFM, which is a public ministry, and the CICIG, that it's the Commission from UN for the Anti-Corruption and Impunity fight, and that they're working also alongside with the civilians. They're constantly bringing out very important cases so that people have an idea of how far the corruption goes, as far as within the government, but also within the private companies that are the corruptors. You know, like the counterpart for the corruption within civil society. And that's pretty much what we're doing. It has to be understood that we had 30 years of repression, and during those 30 years people became very scared of talking or even thinking, I think, about the corruption. And so this is a muscle that we're just starting to get to know how it works. And but I see people like housewives and people in real estate like me, or people in different areas that are not political, that are more involved in the discussion, and that are eager to go to the protest. Like yesterday, we have a protest in the whole country, and usually middle class will say, oh, they're not allowing transport to go through, and we're losing a lot of money. And nowadays, people say, okay, maybe it's not the best way to do protest, but we understand what their demands are. And I'm talking about like the demands of the people, rural people demands on water and electricity and education and health, and people understand a little bit more. So it's bringing people closer together. And I think this is going to be a very long process. It's not going to yield results within, or really huge results. I mean, but we are seeing changes. We're like Congress published the salaries of all the people that works in there that were outrageous. Janitors earning $10,000 a month, while a doctor in a public hospital was earning $600 a month. I mean, the disparity is really big, but this was made as a result of the civil movement. And we're still applying pressure and letting people know what is going on.
Okay, so we've got probably time for 2 more questions, and I will unmute Anil again to see whether we can connect. Anil, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
You hear? Okay, good. I wrote my questions there anyway. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I
ask one of them.
enjoyed thoroughly. Yeah. Just to mention one technique that some of my colleagues applied in Nepal was to distribute a T-shirt with lots of very harsh words in terms of corruption and corrupt officials, and that technique became very controversial. So definitely it had a lot of impact. Now my question is to Lucia. I recently came across some academic papers talking about huge irregularities in the process of sending the Guatemalan agricultural workers to Canada, especially even some personnel within the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and some former staff who were with IOM, and afterwards they themselves started the whole process. So my question is about the sources, not only the local sources of corruption, about the international sources of corruption. There are international interfaces like IOM and others, which in a way, to some extent, have been responsible in creating, kind of a system that would encourage corruption. So how you guys in Guatemala are dealing with these problems? Are there non-violent movements or others going on? It was interesting to know there was the United Nations anti-corruption body is also there, but still, I just wanted to hear your thoughts and the development on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Lucia?
Yeah, it was, I lost the sound every now and then, so it's really hard.
Yeah, so the question was about possible international sources of corruption that would come from such organizations, apparently like International Migration Organization that Anil just brought us an example, but that he read somewhere in academic papers. So, but he was more interested, and probably the question would be: are there corruptions that are brought from outside rather than just from Guatemala, from international actors? And then if so, whether there are any campaigns that would be formed and emerged to tackle the corruption which the source comes from abroad rather than from the domestic arena.
Yeah, most of the corruption that are coming from outside, it's working with the corruption in here. Like for instance, there is a case that it's called TCQ, where the former president and former vice president were giving something like $20 million to sign a contract to give out a piece of the port, international port in the southern part of the country. This is a seaport, and they allow them to build a place where containers can be set in order to put them in other ships and ship them away. And but they gave this area for a lower price than it should be done, and it's a little bit complicated. And here we have a Spanish company that it's the one that it's paying the president and the vice president in order to do that. Or we have another case where, like the Panama Papers, where the company allowed people from Guatemala to, politicians from Guatemala to place money so they wouldn't pay taxes just as with everybody else around the world. But as far as people coming into Guatemala and having like gangs or something like that, we don't really have that much problem, except with the gang of Salvatruchas from El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
That I think it's pretty much in everywhere. And we're not dealing with that a lot. We're not dealing a lot.
Now, that will be the question from one participant that can be addressed by any one of you, which is actually about the connection between corruption and violence. And Travis Green is asking about what are the ways for civil resistance and for activists to fight organized crime, violent organized crime, while at the same time fighting corruption. So if you have some kind of examples where people are mobilizing to fight organized crime while at the same time fighting both violence and corruption. Alejandro?
No, ladies first. Shaska, please.
Shaska, go ahead.
You go, Alejandro, then I'll go. Thank you.
Okay, no, I just wanted to mention briefly, because of course corruption is one of the main facilitators for drug trafficking. It's one of the main facilitators for trafficking illegal weapons and all of these issues that involve organized crime and that of course bring violence with it. So being very specific to allow time also for Shaska, I think this is very sensitive and it's very complex. So there's a good example in Honduras that is one of the most dangerous countries in the world, probably I think it has the highest murder rates in the world, and the police or big sectors of the police are working or are linked to the drug cartels and other types of organized crime. So what civil society groups are doing together with university actors from the academia, etc., is actually joining forces with the executive to together try to counter such a strong force. In Honduras recently they started a commission that has very prominent people from civil society, including our chapter in Honduras, and what they are doing is starting a process to clean the police. All of this has to be very strongly based in proper research and in proper mechanisms to identify who are the bad elements and who are the good elements within the police force, because of course you have both, no? But they are in this process. It's very dangerous. They receive a lot of threats. Even the people working for us are starting to move their families to another country. So it's really messy. But the message that I want to give here is that in these type of cases, and Lucia mentioned it in a way, I mean, protection comes from joining forces, be it with a branch of government, with the media, with international organizations. Is about having a bigger muscle than the bad that you are fighting against. No? So I think that's essential, and one needs to be triple careful when dealing with issues that have to do with corruption, because the moment you start touching the police, like in the case of Honduras or others, you are directly touching the interests of organized crime, and organized crime is not going to think twice before reacting in a violent way. No? So that would be my first reaction. I mean, it's essential to do something about it, but one has to go in broad coalitions. One cannot go alone.
Okay. Shaska?
I think Alejandro is pointing out something that is a fundamental principle or dynamic of civil resistance, is that you have power in numbers. That anyone, when they're alone, is much easier to crush than a larger number of people, whatever that number may be for the context of the struggle. It can be, so a community can be a large number in one context, a country, the citizens of a country can be a large number in another context. So that's very key. And if you are fighting, I mean, again, looking at the examples of fighting against organized crime, I would refer back to the Addio Pizzo movement in Italy. Again, this was clearly based upon the power of numbers, because anytime one person spoke up, they were killed. Judges were murdered. Business people were murdered. But when there was a group of people that spoke up together and acted collectively and found what we could call everyday acts of resistance to start weakening the grip that the mafia had on the city of Palermo, then it became more difficult for the mafia to retaliate. And when they did, in the one instance when they did retaliate violently and set fire to a business, there was huge backfire. Backfire meaning that there was a huge collective outcry and that this act of violence actually backfired on the perpetrators. They lost even more credibility and support, and the movement and the citizens gained more credibility and support. I mean, it's a very complicated topic, but there's a lot written, and if our questioner participant would like more information, they can certainly be in touch with us afterwards. But I would also mention that this linkage between corruption and violent conflict is very clear. That, I mean, corruption can breed violent conflict, both directly and indirectly. Directly, as Alejandro mentioned, is that because it facilitates the activities of armed groups, either nations that are engaging in war or non-state actors that are engaging in violent acts, whether those are gangs, as Lucia mentioned, it can be paramilitary groups, it can be, which are actually linked to the state, or it can be guerrilla groups, or it can be extremist religious groups, but it facilitates, it enables them to function. And indirectly, it can also foster violence, because when corruption is so endemic, it creates such huge grievances that then people are more susceptible to joining violent groups, because they think that they don't have any other alternative. Of course, we would argue that through civil resistance they do have another alternative, but people may feel that they have no other alternative. And I would just mention in closing that there is a very interesting example from Colombia of the peace community of San Jose Aparecido, if I pronounced it correctly. And ICNC has a monograph that has just been published. It can be downloaded from our website, of how one community that was caught in the crossfire of the conflict, the civil war and the narco trafficking in Colombia, has, with great effort, some losses, some deaths nonetheless, but with great effort, managed to control and stop the violence that had been destroying their community, and keep almost like a little neutral boundary around their community and keep their community peaceful.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Great, so that concludes our webinar. There were many more questions that we will send to you all, so you can respond in writing. We have recorded our webinar. We'll post our webinar on the website together with your responses to the questions that we didn't have chance to address. So I would like to thank Lucia, Alejandro, Shaska. Thank you for coming together and shining more light on this fascinating topic of anti-corruption struggles led by ordinary people without violence. So I would like to thank participants, again panelists, and wish everyone a very good day.